with the Muslims, and strangely from the Christian perspective, kept them.
Yes.
The Muslims never broke a treaty. The Christians were superb at it. They were well practiced. And it was their strategic ineptitude, or that of their Grand Master, Gerard de Villefort, which led to the disastrous defeat at the Battle of the Horns of Matin, and ultimately to the loss of the Holy Land. Very headstrong and rash man, carries on his shoulders an enormous responsibility.
Yes.
Then, with the fall of the Holy Land, the Templars apparently lost their complete raison d'etre and started to develop facilities and skills that they'd well established over their previous 200 years of history, because they weren't just warrior knights. They were landowners big time. They owned properties that stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the Bosphorus. They owned vineyards, they owned farms, they owned quarries, they owned flour mills, they owned shipping.
Yeah.
Not only to transport their goods and services to the Holy Land, but also pilgrims. They were also in the export business. They would transfer wine from one country to another. Because of their expertise in transferring money from all their commercial enterprises in Europe, which only had one ultimate aim, to finance the work in the Holy Land, they became experts in the transfer of funds. They adopted a Muslim idea, which they pinched from the Sufis, called the note of hand. They were the precursors of the modern-day travel industry, the package tour business. Arranging pilgrimages, group pilgrimages from one place to another. They invented the 12th century equivalent of the credit card. If you were going on a long pilgrimage, you would go to your local Templar commandery and deposit a sum of money and get a coded chit.
So you get a master's card?
Yeah, almost. But except it was a coded letter, and you presented this to the Templar commander of every town you stopped in, and he dispersed the monies to your hotel keeper and gave alms to the church of your choice, recoded your chit, and you took it on. And when you returned, if you survived that long, you handed it back to the original issuer, and you would either get a bill or the change.
The purpose of the Templars seems to have altered, therefore, from the start, of, you know, the reclamation of the land that you claim that they believed was theirs, Palestine.
Well, their purpose was, first of all, to retain their patrimony, but also to spread the benefits of their knowledge in the communities in which they moved. Just like, in a sense, the Cathars.
Their knowledge.
Their knowledge. Key point. Here we go, you see. They were founded by a group of families called Rex Deus, who had preserved the original Gnostic teachings of Jesus.
These are the real Da Vinci Code.
Yes. And if you trace that type of teaching back to ancient Egypt, it was the first time we've got it really well documented, and it goes back beyond that again into Zoroastrianism, and possibly into Babylon. But in Egypt we have the documentation. The hereditary priestly caste in the royal house of Egypt, who were part of them, had immense privileges, but they also had access to spiritual knowledge, or gnosis, the benefits of which they did not use for themselves, they used for the benefit of the entire country. So the Egyptian people, for example, had a health service which was unrivaled. They were doing complex brain surgery and surviving it 3 millennia before we were able to develop it in Europe. They had building skills of incomparable standards. Their knowledge of science and of nature was beyond belief. And yet they're regarded somehow as primitive. And they were sharing that knowledge for the benefit of all. And wherever you get true Gnosticism operating, whether through one of the brotherhoods or anything else, it is not just for the people concerned. They have a sacred duty to spread it laterally into society. You go to a modern Freemasonic lodge today, for example, and they will say that we will teach you spiritual principles that make good men better through ritual and allegory. But then those good men are under an obligation to spread that teaching, or the fruits of that teaching, into their own communities, which is why you find such massive charitable involvement of Freemasonry. Who support children's hospitals, medical research, lifeboats, God, and the list is almost endless.
Of course, we also have highlighted to us with the Templars and the Freemasons the duality within the mind of man.
Yes.
Because both groups did bad too.
Yes. Well, we're all human.
Yeah.
We are all human.
And this is the teaching of Gnosticism, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And the idea is that spiritual teaching makes good men better. People have some very bizarre ideas about spirituality. There's black and white, good and bad. Not so. There is spirituality or there is an absence of it.
Yeah.
Spiritual knowledge and power can be used for good or ill, depending on the inclination of the person who possesses it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why the ancients, in their wisdom, had such strict regimes for allowing novices to enter on the spiritual path, and such a prolonged period, usually 7 or 8 years or more, of preparation before they're allowed to enter. Not only because of the dangers inherent in the spiritual path itself, but to sort out the sheep from the goats before they got any power. They didn't want evil people attaining power. So Gnosticism is part of the key. And people claim, mistakenly, that, for example, Freemasonry sprang from the Templars. Not so. There was no direct link whatsoever. There is an indirect link, and it's a very powerful one. The Templars and the Freemasons, the Grail Sagas and the Tarot, are all byproducts from the same genealogical tree, but separated by considerable gaps in time.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's interesting that the real Da Vinci Code here, it still involves the Cathars, still involves the Templars. It's just a different family.
Yes, a different series of families, and with different motivations. Don't forget the Da Vinci Code was a work of fiction, and Dan Brown, who's a lovely man, was writing a thriller, and he wrote the damn good one. So he has perfectly legitimate creative license to write what he wishes. I'm a historian. I'm a cultural historian. I'm a retired psychologist. My particular curiosity is, why did people do what they did at that time? And to understand that, I have to go back to the belief systems and the spiritual and economic conflicts that were operating in those days. And it is very, very difficult indeed for somebody living in the 21st century in one of the Western countries, such as Britain or America, to cast their mind back 600 or 800 years and accurately visualize what it was like to be a peasant or a merchant or a knight or anything in the 14th or 13th centuries, when life was brutal, short, and beset by fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of occult powers, fear of evil spirits.
Bringing it up to fairly modern times, we seem to have divided Palestine and created a new state there, called Israel, and the British were highly involved in that. Are there any links there that you know of?
The only links to the past there I can bring forth are the very simple and brutal ones. If you don't learn from history, you're condemned to repeat it.
Yes.
I am, thank God, not suffering from a disease of being English. It's a terminal condition for which there's no cure. I was brought up to burn everything English except their coal. But England's actions towards the end of the First World War and immediately thereafter have left us the seeds of the disastrous conflicts we have today. They promised the land of Palestine to the people who lived there, provided they would fight for them against the Turks, which they did. The Balfour Declaration also promised it to the Jews. Now, it wasn't Balfour's land to give away anyway. We also made a promise, the British government, to not to dismember the Turkish Empire, which was large, rambling, not very efficient, but relatively peaceful, where people of different faiths lived in autonomous self-governing areas, such as the Kurds, the Sunnis, and Shiites. We broke our promises in the West, and Winston Churchill created the modern land of Iraq, for example, by drawing lines on a map, trying to recreate his impression of ancient Mesopotamia.
That's why they're straight on the map.
That's right, and that's why we now have an ungovernable country, which has been ungovernable since its creation,
Yes.
where Kurds fight Shiites and Shiites